US President Donald Trump is set to meet Russian President Vladimir Putin this Friday in Alaska in a summit that has already sparked concern across Europe and Kyiv. With Ukraine and European leaders largely sidelined, questions are mounting about what the meeting could mean for the future of the war in Ukraine and European security. We speak now to Dr Terence McNamee, Global Affairs Specialist and Senior Fellow at the Montreal Institute of Global Security, that's in Canada, for his analysis. Dr McNamee, thank you so much for joining us. How are you on this Thursday?
Fine, thank you.
Right. How significant is it that Ukraine and European leaders are not directly included in this Trump-Putin meeting?
Well, it's hugely significant, and I think it turns the meeting into more of a listening exercise. I think everyone is lowering expectations in terms of there to be change on the ground. There's a lot at stake for President Trump, but I think for President Putin, the fact that the meeting is occurring is already a win. I mean, this to some extent ends his isolation from the West. He can feel that he's sort of coming back into the international community to some extent. But the stakes are very high. But at the same time, I think expectations have been lowered. But as you mentioned, in terms of Europe and Ukraine, they're obviously on pins and needles because they don't want anything to be agreed in their absence.
President Zelensky has warned against any talks about Ukraine without Ukraine being there. From a diplomatic standpoint, how damaging could this exclusion be?
Well, it's hugely damaging, but again, it depends on whether anything is agreed to at the meeting. I mean, it is quite possible President Putin is bringing a business delegation. So what might happen is investment deals may be struck on critical minerals or rare earths. President Putin might also try and soften President Trump up by forging some new initiative on arms control or nuclear weapons. So, to some extent, the conversation, of course, is going to be about Ukraine. But President Trump has already said, lowering expectations, that it's not his business to make peace between Russia and Ukraine, which is something of a departure from his pre-election commitment to end the war within 24 hours. So it's an open question exactly what the focus of the discussions is going to be. Of course, it's going to include Ukraine, but it could also shift.
The White House is calling this a listening exercise for President Donald Trump. Is that simply managing expectations in your view, or does it signal a lack of a clear U.S. strategy? You touched that it could be on business, it could be on arms, this meeting.
Yeah, I mean, it's often said that President Trump enters these meetings underprepared and overconfident. And I think on this particular occasion, his team is certainly reining him in because we have to remember that if he tries to forge some kind of land swap, say this idea of sacrificing parts of eastern Ukraine, part of the Donbass, one, Ukraine can't do that anyway as part of its constitution. But also, the American public opinion is still pretty strongly behind Ukraine. And Zelensky has proven himself quite a skillful communicator, going above and beyond Trump to the American people and to the US's traditional allies. So I think that's got to be a grave concern for President Trump. But we have to remember that this is very important for your listeners, is that this land swap issue is something of a distraction because President Putin's goal is clear. He wants to reinvade the rest of Ukraine and essentially end Ukraine as a political entity. We shouldn't kid ourselves. That is the ultimate objective of President Putin.
And on that notion of land swaps, Kiev has already rejected it. Why do you think it's so controversial at this particular time?
Yeah, well, remember, Ukraine has seen this movie before. In 2014, when Russia invaded the Crimea and captured the Crimea, as the price for peace, Ukraine temporarily gave it over to Russia. I say temporarily because I think it hasn't given up its ambition to eventually get Crimea back. But the point is that it did concede that territory in 2014. But of course, as it proved, that was no guarantee of peace. So again, Ukraine has been here before. They're quite right not to accept, the bona fides of any kind of land swap idea because they understand that effectively they're meaningless.
If this summit leads to a deal that locks in Russian territorial gains, what would the implications for European security be?
Well, they will be massive because, again, as I said, this thing about little chunks of land in eastern Ukraine, they are a distraction. President Putin and Russia's ambition is to end the state of Ukraine, to take it over. And so Europe will be hugely concerned. And remember that President Putin is probably going to try and use this meeting to drive a wedge through NATO because the last NATO meeting was obviously very successful. I mean, President Trump was able to get member nations to ratchet up their GDP commitments to defense. And so Putin sees that there's a kind of newfound unity or solidarity in NATO, and he would like to disrupt that. So I think, yeah, this massive geopolitical stakes here for Europe, for Ukraine, for President Trump. And I think the only person really here who mostly this is just an upside is for is President Putin.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. McNamee. We'll leave it there for now, and we appreciate your insights.
Pleasure.